My name is Marble Ashford, 37 years old. If you want dinner, lick it off the floor. My mom sneered as she slapped my plate away. Chocolate frosting splattered across her polished hardwood. The cake I had been savoring just seconds before smeared in brown streaks across the glossy boards. The sweet smell cloyed in the air. Forks stilled. Conversation died. If you have ever felt betrayed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, let me know where you are watching from. I am the only daughter of Lorraine Ashford, the woman now standing above me, wineglass raised, basking in her own cruelty. For as long as I can remember, my mother has turned gatherings into stages. I've played the role of the scapegoat, the silent target of her wit sharpened into knives. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of nothing more than her hosting another grand supper. For me, it was another reminder that blood ties don't always bind with love. Heat rose in my chest, but I did not let it spill out as anger. I sat straighter, smoothed the lapel of my coat with deliberate calm, and rose from my chair. The silence thickened as every eye followed me. My brother Caleb looked away, my mother's lips curled in triumph, convinced she had once again reduced me to nothing. I stepped closer until I could feel her perfume, heavy with lilies and power. Leaning down, I let my voice carry just enough for her to hear and for the room to sense the shift. I know everything. Her smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The stem of her glass trembled almost imperceptibly. I straightened, nodded once, and walked away from the table, the crunch of cake under my shoe breaking the silence. The story of how I reached this moment had been building for years, long before the plate hit the floor. The silence of that dinner clung to me long after I left my mother's house, carried in the humid savannah air as I drove past moss-draped oaks and brick-lined squares. The city has always worn its history like a heavy gown, grand, ornate, suffocating in many ways. My mother fit perfectly here. Lorraine Ashford had been a widow for over a decade, but she wore the role like a crown. She polished grief into spectacle, turning my father's death into another jewel in her collection of tragedies she could display at luncheons. In the grand halls of our family's historic home, she presided with marble counters gleaming, silver polished until it blinded, portraits of ancestors staring down from gilt frames as if they approved her performance. Growing up, I learned quickly that love was measured by presentation. My mother demanded pressed dresses, practiced smiles, and silence whenever her friends visited. If I forgot to fold my napkin just so, her hand would clamp on my wrist under the table, nails sharp against my skin, her voice never breaking its gracious tone as she corrected me. Each cruelty was small, almost invisible to others, but they gathered like stones in my chest. My father had been the buffer. His laugh softened the air. His presence made her sharp edges tolerable. When he died, something in our home hardened beyond repair. I stayed connected because leaving felt like turning my back on him, attending dinners, enduring her barbs. It was my way of honoring his memory. Caleb, my younger brother, thrived under her gaze. He was the golden child, praise for achievements that often weren't his alone. I remember one recital where I played piano and he simply turned pages for me. Yet afterward, the guests congratulated him, and my mother beamed as if he'd been the star. That night, I cried in my room, not because I'd been overlooked, but because I realized it had never been about me at all. Over the years, Caleb learned to mirror her charm, her smile, her casual dismissals, and I remained the shadow at the table, the reminder she could never quite erase. After that dinner, I avoided the house for weeks, but obligations pull stronger than resentment. And one Sunday afternoon, I found myself walking back through the carved oak doors of the Ashford home. The smell was the same, polish and lavender sachets tucked into drawers. But the study felt different. It was my father's room, once filled with quiet dignity. Dark wood shelves lined with law books, his leather chair worn smooth from late nights of reading, the desk where he'd let me doodle beside his neat notes. I went in seeking comfort, but my eyes caught immediately on the gaps. The glass case on the sideboard was empty. His silver cufflinks engraved with his initials were gone. The pocket watch he had carried every day of his career was missing from its velvet stand. I searched drawers, checked boxes, even opened the safe behind the portrait. Nothing. My chest tightened as if I'd been robbed, though no stranger had broken in. Only family moved freely here. Later that week, a bill arrived at my apartment by mistake, forwarded from the estate. My father's name printed at the top, dated months after his burial. Utilities paid automatically as though he still walked these halls. It unsettled me, like his ghost was being used to sign checks he never approved. My unease sharpened into suspicion when I ran into Mrs. Holcomb, the neighbor across the square. She leaned on her cane, eyes bright with curiosity, as she told me she'd seen estate meetings taking place at odd hours, strangers in suits arriving through the back entrance, papers carried in leather portfolios. I nodded politely, but her words sank into me like ice. Lorraine had dismissed questions about finances before, claiming she was simply streamlining. Yet the missing heirlooms, the lingering bills, the quiet comings and goings, each detail layered onto the last. I stood on the sidewalk outside the house, staring up at its shuttered windows. What I had once brushed aside as her carelessness no longer felt innocent. For the first time, irritation gave way to a darker certainty, a sense that something was being hidden in plain sight. I had always told myself that walking away was safer than confrontation, that silence was a kind of shield. But after the heirlooms disappeared and the neighbors whispered about late-night meetings, I stopped trusting silence. I began small. After each visit to my mother's house, I spoke into the recorder on my phone while sitting in my car, documenting what I had noticed. Missing photographs, new art on the walls that I knew she couldn't afford, the names she dropped of bankers I'd never met. Soon, I started taking discreet photos, gaps on shelves where antiques once sat, envelopes stamped with law firm insignias left open on the hall table. The more I gathered, the less I doubted my instincts. The turning point came one Friday lunch. Lorraine had insisted on meeting at the Old Pink House, a Savannah institution where chandeliers glowed against peeling plaster walls. She liked the theater of being seen there. I set my phone on the mantel beside our table, screen dark but recording. She sipped her wine and spoke in the casual tone she reserved for confidences disguised as boasts. "I've had to reallocate some of your father's assets," she said, waving her fork as though discussing wallpaper. "After all, I earned them. Decades of sacrifice entitled me to decide how they're used." My stomach lurched, but I kept my expression flat, stirring my soup. The phone captured every syllable, the faint clink of her bracelet as she gestured, even the pride in her voice as she described herself as the true architect of the Ashford legacy. Then she noticed my phone. Her eyes narrowed. "Why is that sitting up there?" For one breathless second, I thought it was over. My pulse hammered so loud I was sure she could hear it. I reached casually, slipping the device into my purse. "Just keeping the table clear," I said, forcing a smile. She seemed satisfied, turning her attention back to the menu. I excused myself soon after, hands trembling as I clutched my bag. Outside, beneath the shade of a live oak, I finally listened to the recording. Her voice spilled into my ears, arrogant and unguarded. Shame pressed hard against my ribs for needing proof against my own mother. But beneath it burned something stronger, determination. Caleb showed up at my apartment 2 nights after that lunch, a 6-pack in hand and the same easy smile that had always charmed people into forgiving him. He dropped onto my couch as though he lived there, stretching out long legs, tapping a rhythm on the coffee table. "Mom says you've been difficult again," he announced, cracking open a bottle. "Why do you always have to push her? She's done everything for us." The words struck with the weight of déjà vu. I'd heard them before from her lips, dressed up as sermons about gratitude. Now they came from him, unfiltered, as if he'd memorized her script. "She's been moving things around," I said carefully, keeping my tone neutral. "Dad's belongings, accounts that should be closed." Caleb rolled his eyes. "You're making it sound sinister. It's just a temporary transfer. She explained it to me, consolidating until the estate is fully settled." He took a long pull from his beer, unaware of how tightly I gripped the edge of the cushion. A temporary transfer. The phrase burned in my ears. Proof. Not from a neighbor's gossip or a slip of paper, but from Caleb himself. My heart pounded, yet my face stayed calm. I forced a laugh, asked him about work, about the new project he'd been assigned. He leaned back, eager to talk about himself, oblivious to the storm he had stirred inside me. I watched him as he spoke, the curve of his smile so like our father's, the tilt of his head that used to make me feel safe as a child. I wanted to believe he didn't understand that he was repeating what he'd been told, loyal to a mother who had never let him see her shadows. But complicity doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from comfort, from the ease of believing the version of the story that spares you from choosing sides. When he left, the apartment door clicked shut like a seal. I stood in the quiet, the word temporary echoing in my chest, and knew there was nothing temporary about the betrayal unraveling around me. Caleb's careless words left me restless, pacing the length of my apartment as though motion could quiet the noise in my head. Temporary transfer. I knew better. Still, I needed more than suspicion and fragments. At the office, I confided in Kara, a colleague from compliance. She had a sharp eye for irregularities and a discreet way of keeping confidences. One evening, after everyone else had gone, I slid a stack of forwarded bills and printouts across her desk. She adjusted her glasses, scanning quickly. These aren't just routine payments. Look, withdrawals in round numbers timed right before so-called charity events. And this household fund, it isn't tied to any estate account I can trace. We cross-referenced dates. Every fund transfer lined up neatly with one of my mother's society dinners. The guest list she boasted about suddenly took on a different meaning, each one financed by something missing from my father's shelves. Kara leaned back, frowning. Marble, these antiques. If she sold them, there should be receipts. Auction houses, dealers, appraisals, unless she's moving them quietly. That night, I began digging. A local dealer confirmed a sale of a gold pocket watch with initials that matched my father's. Another described a set of silver cufflinks. Both transactions dated within weeks of the items vanishing from the study. Each confirmation cut deeper than the last. I remembered my father winding that watch before church, the tick, steady as his voice when he reminded me to speak truth even when it cost me comfort. Now his keepsakes were scattered, traded for dinners that sparkled only on the surface. I bought a heavy binder, the kind used for legal cases, and began assembling everything. Dates, receipts, photos of the empty spaces where heirlooms once sat. Page by page, the story wrote itself in stark ink. Grief tightened my throat as I slid the final document into a plastic sleeve. Yet beneath the grief was something steadier, resolve. The binder closed with a snap, and for the first time I felt the balance shift. My mother's house of marble and silver might still glitter, but I was the one holding the ledger now. The dining room shimmered with polished crystal and heavy silver, as though the table itself were meant to remind us of the Ashford name. My mother raised her glass, her voice smooth with performative warmth. "To family," she declared, then turned the toast into a dagger. With a flick of her hand, she struck my plate, sending chocolate cake and frosting sliding to the floor. The room froze. Caleb laughed uncertainly, but the sound died when she added, "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor." The sting of humiliation was sharp, but I no longer trembled under it. I sat tall, smoothed my coat, and rose. Every detail from the past weeks, the missing heirlooms, the neighbor's whispers, the binder heavy with evidence, burned steady inside me. I stepped closer, the hush so complete I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. My mother's smile widened, expecting another retreat. Instead, I leaned close enough to catch the edge of her perfume and whispered 3 words. "I know everything." Her glass faltered, a ripple crossed her face, something raw, almost human, before she rearranged it into disdain. Caleb blinked, glancing between us, confusion etched into his features. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. I straightened, let the silence stretch, then turned toward the table. "Tomorrow," I said evenly. "My apartment. Noon. Bring your questions. I'll bring the answers." Chairs creaked. Forks shifted nervously. One of the cousins coughed into his napkin. Lorraine's lips parted as if to strike back, but no words came. The air around her seemed thinner, as though the foundation of her performance had cracked. I picked up my bag, ignoring the smear of cake beneath my shoe, and walked toward the door. Behind me, the room buzzed with whispers, Caleb's voice cutting through, hesitant, uncertain. But I didn't stop. For the first time, I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leading them somewhere they'd never expected me to take them, out of her shadow, into the light of truth. My apartment smelled of coffee and warm bread, the sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains onto a table set with simple plates and mismatched mugs. It was no banquet hall, no stage for performance, just a place where people could sit close enough to hear the truth. Caleb arrived first, his tie loose as if he hadn't decided whether to treat this as serious or casual. A few of our cousins trailed in after, their voices hushed, glancing around my modest living room with curiosity. Finally, Lorraine entered, wrapped in her tailored jacket, lips pressed thin, her eyes flicking over the chipped edges of my table as though insulted by their plainness. I didn't wait for pleasantries. I slid the binder onto the table and opened it. The first page, a photo of Father's watch, listed on a dealer's site. The next, cufflinks sold the same week. Receipts followed, each one paired with the date of one of Lorraine's grand dinners. Whispers rippled through the room. Caleb leaned forward, his hand braced on the table. "Mom," Lorraine's laugh was sharp. "Do you think your father built all this for it to gather dust? He wanted me to enjoy life, to represent this family with dignity. I've done what he would have wanted." I pressed play on my phone. Her voice spilled into the room, recorded at lunch, clear and confident. "I've had to reallocate some of your father's assets. After all, I earned them. Decades of sacrifice entitle me to decide how they're used." Lorraine's face drained of color. That was taken out of context. Caleb shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the papers. "You told me it was temporary, that everything was above board." "It is," she snapped. "Do you think these dinners host themselves? Do you think prestige comes free?" The room had shifted. The cousins who once nodded at her every word now sat rigid, their gazes avoiding hers. Caleb rubbed his temples, his usual ease gone, replaced by a heavy uncertainty. For the first time, I saw him falter, the golden child staring at tarnish he couldn't polish away. I closed the binder gently, the snap of its rings final against the murmurs. The truth was on the table now, laid bare among coffee cups and scattered crumbs, where no chandelier could distract from what had been lost, and what still might be reclaimed. The morning after the brunch, I walked into a law office on Bull Street, with the binder pressed to my chest. The attorney, Ms. Perez, listened carefully, her pen gliding across a yellow pad as I laid out every receipt, photo, and transcript. She didn't flinch when I played the recording. Instead, she leaned back, her voice calm and precise. "We'll petition the court to freeze contested accounts. From this point forward, nothing moves without oversight." That night, an envelope slid under my door. My mother's reply, not in her handwriting, but in the language of her lawyer. Words like defamation and estrangement stared back at me. She was threatening, not explaining. The woman who had once corrected my table manners now fought me with legal jargon. The temptation to fight fire with fire was strong. I imagined standing in the square downtown, handing out copies of her recorded words, letting the city that adored her see the rot beneath the polish. The thought made my hands tremble, not with fear, but with longing for vindication. Instead, I slid the fantasy aside. Dignity had to matter more than spectacle. I wasn't here to humiliate her. I was here to protect what my father left behind, and the fragments of peace I still held. Caleb came by late, his shoulders sagging under a weight he had never carried before. He lingered at the door before speaking. "I didn't know the half of it," he admitted, voice low. "I thought she was handling things. I'm sorry, Marbell." I studied his face, searching for traces of the boy who used to share secrets with me under the porch steps. For the first time in years, I saw him without the sheen of her approval. "If you want," he added, "I can help track down what's left, the heirlooms. Maybe we can get some back." The offer wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Months passed before I opened my apartment to family again. The table was small, covered with a cotton cloth I'd stitched years ago, the edges frayed but clean. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with the kind of smell that makes people lean back in their chairs and sigh, content. Caleb arrived first, carrying a basket of bread still warm from the bakery. His face had changed, lines of strain etched deeper, but the arrogance gone. Behind him came two cousins, who had stood silent at my mother's side for years, now quieter, gentler, carrying bottles of wine with apologetic smiles. We squeezed around the table, knees bumping, laughter breaking through in awkward bursts at first, then flowing easier as the evening wore on. There were no crystal goblets, no speeches rehearsed for admiration, no chandeliers catching false light, just mugs and plates, simple and sturdy, passing from hand to hand. Lorraine was absent. The courts had bound her with restitution, counseling, obligations she could no longer dismiss with charm. Her voice did not echo here, and for once I did not feel the ache of her absence. The silence she left was not emptiness. It was space to breathe. As the conversation swelled around me, I carried a plate from the counter and set it gently before Caleb. The weight of it steadied in my hands. No one knocked it away. No one sneered. The plate stayed where it belonged, filled whole. I looked around the table at faces softened by honesty rather than performance, and felt the shift settle deep within me. Respect was finally here. Not demanded, not stolen, simply served.